PhD from Hyderabad on science fiction, and then very smoothly migrated to the areas of language policy, multilingual education, and very keenly, and currently keenly studying the linguistic diversity of this country. He also works on linguistic human rights. He writes blogs on these topics in English and Esperanto. In fact, he has access to one unique language that most of us do not have. He's unique in that way. And we have been meeting in many conferences and to discuss language policy of this country. And I know he has a very critical take on teaching of English in school as well as higher education. So I invite him to deliver his lecture on the illusory promise of English in India, democracy, language, and marginalization. Thank you. Welcome. Dr. Rao, I think we'll go up to 12:45 or 1 o'clock. When do we? 12:45, I think. Okay. So how will it be? You take 35 minutes and then minutes, 10 minutes. Yeah, 30 to 35 minutes, so that we can open the floor to audience for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning or afternoon. I'm representing here both my university, the Azim Premji University in Bengaluru in India, as well as the World Esperanto Association, La Universala Esperanto Asocio. The Esperanto movement engages deeply with the themes of linguistic democracy and more generally language and development. Indeed, the deliberations of this conference will feed into the conference organized by the World Esperanto Association in April 2016 in New York on language and the sustainable development goals. I invite those of you who are interested to also join our study group on language and the United Nations. I'm calling my presentation The Illusory Promise of English in India, Language, Democracy, and Marginalization. We know of many examples of the hegemonic spread of English worldwide. What about India? This presentation tries to map the current place of English in the multilingual landscape of India. For this, we need to know something about the language hierarchies in this deeply unequal society. We need to know of the emancipatory promise of English as a way to bypass these hierarchies, the state of the education system in India, and what can be done to move towards a more empowering multilingualism that includes English. The country, like many others in the region, is multilingual in complex ways, depending on what one counts as language and what as dialect. We get a variety of estimates of the country's languages. Similarly, the number of English speakers in India has various estimates from no more than 1%, according to a 2009 government report, to almost 1 in 3 Indians, according to a 1997 poll by a magazine. Clearly, this range does not offer a basis for judging the spread of English in India. However, what is clear is that English is increasingly perceived as a key factor in social and economic mobility. One indication is the mushrooming of English medium private schools, the doom schools that Professor Mohanty spoke about this morning. Nearly 30% of children in 2012 were enrolled in private schools. With an annual growth rate of 10%, half of India's rural children, half of the children in rural India are expected to be in private schools by 2018. Private tutoring, too, has expanded considerably. Further, increasingly, government schools have an English medium section side by side with a non-English medium, sections. However, as Professor Mohanty demonstrated in the morning, private and government schools often are only nominally English medium. The actual teaching happens in the regional language. We will look at the education system more closely in a moment. In India and in the South Asian region generally, livelihood arguments for English are one part of the story. Livelihood arguments that improves chances of livelihood. Another part of the story in these societies emerges from caste-based discrimination, still a daily reality for many, not a rumor, as some have claimed. Unsurprisingly, languages too are deployed to maintain and reproduce caste inequalities. Institutionally, through the education and legal systems, for example, and culturally, through mass media and the film industries, for example, some dialects are valorized as standard languages, while others are deprecated as mere, even impure dialects. Evidence for these rigid hierarchies and discrimination abounds in writings in various genres by Dalits, religious and linguistic minorities, and women in many Indian languages over the last several decades. Here are two examples to get a sense of how language hierarchies function within caste and gender-based discrimination. In a poem called "From These Stubs, Steel Nibs Are Sprouting," from these stubs, steel nibs are sprouting, the Telugu poet Sikhamani, Sikhamani, Sikhamani recalls becoming aware about caste discrimination. He says, and I quote, "When in literary discussion my two Brahmin friends found my language inept, my suspicion came home to stay." And later in the poem, someone asks, "Is Sikhamani SC, a scheduled caste?" I mistook him for an OC, for an other category, other caste, judging by his poetic sensibility. And the poet observes, "This distinguished person's thoughtless compliment hardens my suspicion. I cringe at his confidence that only a certain caste can write poetry." Speaking of his steel nib as a sword, Sikhamani menacingly concludes in Telugu, "It has just changed hands," the steel nib. "It has just changed hands and no longer recognizes you. No Manu to save you now." Marathi is another literary tradition with a vibrant body of writing from the margins. In The Story of My Sanskrit, Kumud Paude, P-A-W-D-E, Paude, describes her even greater transgression, that a woman from a caste that is the lowest of the low should learn Sanskrit, and not only that, also teach it, is a dreadful anomaly to the traditional mind. As she reports, all sorts of indirect efforts were systematically made to prevent me from learning Sanskrit. "You won't be able to manage. There will be no one at home to help you. Sanskrit is very difficult," etc., etc. But I was firm as a rock, she says. At university, she encounters the head of the department, a scholar of all India repute, she says. He didn't like my learning Sanskrit and would make it clear that he didn't. And he took a malicious delight in doing so. The sharp claws of his taunts left my mind wounded and bleeding. In a way, I had developed a terror of this great Pandit. His manner of speaking was honeyed and reasonable, but filled with venom. Even as she appears for job interviews, the taunts don't stop. In other places, the moment I had been interviewed and stepped out of the room, there would be a burst of derisive laughter. I would hear words like sharp needles. "So now even these people are to teach Sanskrit. Government Brahmins, are they?" And the ones who said this weren't themselves Brahmins, but so-called reformers from the lower caste who considered themselves anti-Brahmin and talked of the heritage of Jyotiba Phule. They flogged the mass of lower castes with their caste consciousness, and yet they found it distasteful that a girl from the Mahar caste, which was one of the lower castes, should teach Sanskrit. This then is the other part of the story of English in India. English holds the promise for Dalits and other socially excluded groups to bypass the rigid linguistic hierarchies in the other Indian languages. The emancipatory potential of English must be seen in the context of this anti-Dalit discrimination and the cultural politics of Dalit writings in various Indian languages. African American writing in English was an inspiration for Dalit writing. In a discussion of Dalit literature at one of the colleges set up by Dr. Ambedkar, a couple of scholars said that it should be revolutionary literature, a literature that takes us forward, a literature like that of America's black people. The dramatic declaration of English as the Dalit goddess represents an attempt to create an alternative hegemony that can challenge both traditional linguistic hierarchies as well as the elite appropriation of English. As English in India becomes widespread, it is called upon to serve many functions. Among those are the aspirations of the traditionally marginalized as a tool for social advancement, to equalize opportunities, and to recalibrate historical power equations, as we saw from the examples above of Dalit narrative. In order to serve these needs too, English medium in India, English medium education in India needs to reconfigure its relationships in the language economy of India. But is English a panacea for India's educational crisis? There are two major reasons, I think, to think of this promise of English as illusory. The first is a systemic reason, the state of the education system in India. The second is pedagogic, to do with the need for mother tongue-based multilingual education. The crisis in India's crisis in learning has been meticulously documented, as we will hear more during this conference, by the annual status of education reports, the so-called ASAR reports, a citizen-led survey of some 700,000 children. These surveys test reading and arithmetic skills in every district in rural India. As their website explains, all children between the age group of 5 to 16 are administered a floor-level reading test in the language of their choice. The test is available in 16 Indian languages. The survey finds that in 2014 in rural India, only 48% of the enrolled children in the 5th grade, in the 5th class, only 48% were able to read a second standard textbook, a grade 2 text. That is, 52% were not even able to do that. Over half of our children are at least 3 grades behind where they should be. Further, this is a declining trend. 54% of the students were able to do this task 5 years ago in 2010. Even in India's best performing state, Himachal Pradesh, nearly a quarter of the children are 3 years behind. This is in rural India and mostly in the mother tongue, but we are not talking here about children of indigenous peoples and linguistic minorities. What about India's elite schools? In 2011, a study of 89 top schools, as the report called them, all urban Indian and English medium, of course, concluded that performance in class 4 is found to be below international average. However, Indian students catch up in the 8th grade, mainly due to their achievement in procedural questions, which require straightforward use of techniques. The study also compared students in these schools to an earlier study conducted by the same organizations and reported that learning levels were found to be significantly lower than what was observed in 2006 in the same schools and tested on the same questions. The fall was highest in mathematics and English. The study comments, our top schools don't promote conceptual learning in students. Our results show there has been a further drop from the already unsatisfactory levels of 2006. And a recent international comparison was the 2009 PISA PISA exam, Program for International Student Assessment, which compared 15-year-old boys and girls from 74 countries and territories in mathematics, science, and reading, 74. India figured 73rd. Students from only 2 states participated, the report in Tamil Nadu and Himachal. The report concluded that 15-year-old student populations in Tamil Nadu and Himachal Pradesh were estimated to have among the lowest reading literacy levels of PISA 2009, with more than 80% of the students below the baseline of proficiency. Whether in rural or urban environments, there are many household factors, as we know, that contribute to a child's learning. Parents' educational achievements, especially the mothers, parental involvement in education, family income, and paid private tuition. As the ASAR 2009 report notes, once these factors are controlled for, the contribution of private schools to the child's learning is negligible. The learning differential between government and private schools falls drastically from 20% to a measly 5%. And Azim Premji Foundation report, Private Schools Are No Panacea, goes even further. It's a 2013 report. It suggests that, contrary to popular perceptions, private schools are not adding any value at all compared to government schools, as in the children's main subjects. Previous analyses, like the ASAR report, asked a rhetorical question. Are private schools really performing better than government schools? The answer is no. APF, the Azim Premji Foundation's school choice study, as it was called, follows a different methodology. Government school children in 180 villages in Andhra Pradesh were offered a scholarship, a voucher, to study in a Telugu medium or an English medium private fee-paying school if they wished to. Then the three groups, the scholarship children in private schools, the non-scholarship children in private schools who were already there, and the children in government schools who did not move, were all evaluated over a 5-year period, 2008 to 2013. Analysis of 5 years of test data show that the scholarship children in private schools, children who voluntarily shifted to private schools, perform no better than their counterparts in government schools in Telugu, English, mathematics, and environmental science. This observation over 5 years implies that private schools have not added any significant value to the learning achievement of these children. Indeed, the data suggests that those who shifted to English medium private schools performed significantly worse in both mathematics and Telugu compared to those who shifted to Telugu medium private schools. That is, the persistent illusion of English as the path to a better education once again turns out to be false. This is further borne out in interviews with parents of the scholarship children in private schools. Parents indicated that they are happy with the private schools. The APF report concludes, parents are possibly evaluating school performance, school outcomes on softer factors like uniforms, discipline, attendance in schools, both of teachers and children, and social standing in the community. And this is no doubt that much truer of those who send their children to English medium private schools. The ASER reports, as well as the private school reports and the APU study, all indicate that it is not easy to convince communities that English medium education and private schools do not automatically mean better learning. Just 1 in 5 Indian students who finishes 10 years of schooling enters college. But given the quality of the education that the student has had, it's not surprising that he or she struggles, not least with English, the medium of higher education in India. It is a familiar fact of Indian higher education that while the mandated medium of instruction is English, the default language in the classroom is the local one, as one scholar notes. Not surprisingly, Indian students enter higher education and the workplace with inadequate English skills. One company reports that it rejects 92 to 93% of applicants for poor English. About 65 to 75% of applying engineers are also rejected for the same reasons. Indeed, for students preparing for professional courses, mainly engineering and medicine, the language situation is often even more dire. Millions go to private English medium cram schools, usually after the 7th or 10th grades, in order to train for countrywide and statewide entrance exams to these engineering and medical colleges. These private schools focus exclusively on mathematics and science with low priority for English as a subject and none at all for the local language. In an article titled English Speaking Curse, the journalist Anjali Puri notes the result. The teachers make an important fundamental point, which I hear repeated time and again by teachers in other institutions. These problems have their roots in students being language impoverished rather than just English impoverished. That is demonstrating a poor ability in the regional languages too, and being virtually cut off from the humanities stream from senior school onwards. Thus, while the pressure is tremendous to privatize mass education and make it English medium, a body of research and voices in the media are appearing, providing evidence that is both research-based and anecdotal that counsels caution. The task is to make this evidence available to policymakers by locating it in the larger context of mother tongue-based multilingual education. The foregoing remarks should be seen in the context of what worldwide research tells us about mother tongue medium education. Decades of work confirm that learning is most effective when a child has 8 to 10 years of good teaching through the medium of the mother tongue, accompanied by gradual introduction of other languages, first as subjects, then partly also as teaching languages. This ensures a solid cognitive foundation for learning non-language subjects. It allows acquisition of other languages while retaining and developing the mother tongue, and it results in better learning of other languages when compared to non-mother tongue teaching models. Toves Kutnap-Kangas's research shows this again and again, and several others. These facts are routinely ignored the world over in assimilationist language policies for indigenous peoples. The result has been disastrous educational outcomes. In India, if indigenous children attend school at all, the medium of instruction is the dominant regional language, not the child's mother tongue. Together with other infrastructural barriers, this situation ensures that of the 22.5 million enrolled Indigenous children, over a third are pushed out before the 5th grade. By grade 10, among Indigenous girls in the state of Andhra Pradesh, the dropout rate or push-out rate is 83.6%. A quarter of all rural children attend primary schools where the medium of instruction is different from their home language. So, strengthening a mother tongue-based government school system is a critical component of any strategy to address the poor learning outcomes noted in the previous section. But this does not mean a rejection of English. However, it does mean rethinking the two most common fallacies about language education, quoting Philipson here, Robert Philipson, in the Indian context. For the Indigenous and linguistic minority child, this relates to the regional medium of education, which is not his or her home language. For the child who speaks at home a regional language, these fallacies relate to English medium education. The first fallacy is that of early exposure. This argues that the earlier the child begins English, the better. The second fallacy is that of maximum exposure. This claims that the more subjects one teaches in English, the better. Early exit and early transition to teaching in a non-mother tongue have been repeatedly shown to give poor results. Teaching everything in a foreign language is precisely what promotes rote learning without understanding and kills creativity. In the state of Odisha, the coordinator of an education project kept an education diary, my friend Mahendra Mishra, where he documented the large gap between the enlightened policies of the federal government in New Delhi and the situation in the schools to which the indigenous Koya children go. Only after his patient explanations did the teachers realize that it is possible for the child to learn both the mother tongue and acquire the chief regional language. And that language acquisition can be additive, not necessarily subtractive. What is true of Koya-speaking children being taught in Odia holds for Odia-speaking learners being taught in English. Indeed, Odisha is also the site for a groundbreaking 2014 project on implementing mother tongue-based multilingual education for indigenous children. After decades of advocacy by researchers and activists, Professor Mohanty and Professor Panda here, among others, the state collaborated with the National Multilingual Education Resource Consortium to produce a policy document. The document surveyed worldwide evidence for MLE and made specific recommendations for MLE, multilingual, mother tongue-based multilingual education for Odisha. As the document notes, with 22% of the state's population being indigenous people, speaking 72 mother tongues, grouped into 38 languages, Odisha is in particular need for urgent action in this matter. Based on the policy document, the government of Odisha issued orders making the following provisions. MLE will be extended to all indigenous children in Odisha. The mother tongue will be the medium for the first 5 years. Introduce Odia in class 2 and English in class 3 as language subjects. The policy document recommended that English be introduced in class 4, in fact. Indigenous languages may be used as language subjects at the post-primary level. The policy document recommended that this be actively considered. Teachers fluent in the children's languages as well as competent in Odia and English will get priority in recruitment. A long-term plan to attract indigenous people into teaching jobs and intensive teacher training for MLE pedagogy. Regarding the pedagogy of this MLE program, the government order says that it should effectively challenge the hegemonic positioning of some dominant languages and cultures, fostering a strong sense of identity and pride in the children's own languages and cultures. The Odisha government MLE initiative is one that respects the linguistic human rights of the indigenous learners. It has the potential to become a template for similar MLE efforts elsewhere in the country and indeed the region. Much, as ever, will depend on how it translates into educational practice. The domination of English as a medium for higher education poses enormous difficulties for students. Earlier interventions to address the issue have usually been limited to translating materials into Indian languages. Recently, however, a more systematic effort is to strengthen Indian languages as knowledge languages has been mooted. A Center for Indian Languages and Higher Education was set up in 2012 with the long-term objective of bilingual and, where possible, multilingual proficiency for teacher and student, a proficiency that would bridge the different knowledge worlds that converge in Indian higher education. The center, a consortium of several universities and institutions, seeks to create new materials in Indian languages and use them in the curricula. Such materials would necessarily involve not just textbooks, but also interdisciplinary readers, translations from other Indian languages, mediated translations from English, bridge materials for existing curricula, and non-print materials, including audio and video. Building digital resources would be a complementary task, says the coordinator, Tejaswani Niranjana. Simultaneously, the center is exploring strategies of bi- and multilingual pedagogy. At the policy level, the center plans to lobby to get bodies such as the University Grants Commission to validate Indian language work for faculty promotions and salary rises. Other universities like mine, the Azim Premji University, are setting up mechanisms to move away from English as the sole voice of the university. So in conclusion, thus, the craze for English in India has had multiple effects at various levels. A small number of urban and semi-urban, well-resourced private schools do produce English-enabled students who enter prestigious colleges and universities and later get plum jobs in the private and public sectors. These are the linguistic haves. However, typically these students learn English subtractively. That is, their other languages remain underdeveloped. But the demand for English in the country is high. The policy and market responses to this demand have been to push English down to earlier and earlier grades and to teach more and more subjects only in English. These developments, however, are happening in an educational system in which students are not learning well at all. This is at least partly because the pedagogy is not based on a strategy of mother tongue-based multilingual education. The result is a vast number of linguistic have-nots. Students who are from run-of-the-mill private schools and government school system, and from the government school system in both urban and rural areas. For these academically ill-prepared students, English competence remains a mirage. Only a small proportion of these students enter higher education. There, one of their greatest challenges is the medium of instruction, English. These graduates generally remain at the lower levels of the workforce. English has certainly benefited the privileged, the economically well-off, and those with a tradition of formal education in the family. For the vast majority of Indian students, however, English promises much, but delivers little. In a country with increasing inequalities, English has become a source of social division and exclusion, thereby undermining the social justice agenda of education in a democracy, mass education in a democracy. Besides, India is heavily invested into integrating into the global corporate economy. Aspirations, especially among the young, are soaring. For both the health of India's democracy and in order to realistically prepare a workforce for a modern world, India needs urgent measures to resist and relativize the hegemony of English. English needs to be learnt, yes, well, but learnt additively, not subtractively, at the expense of other languages of the learner. Further, English must remain a part, but only a part, of the country's multilingual ecology. We need to stop English from becoming yet another tool that reproduces traditional inequalities and a hydra that gobbles up other languages. The false, illusory promise of English for the entire population is an existential threat for a large section of the Indian population, both the underprivileged and the aspiring middle classes. However, the examples of innovation in both the school system and in higher education are an encouraging trend. They show that it is indeed possible to confront this hydra. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. I'm really glad to hear so much of data put together to make an argument which should have been part of our intuitive knowledge, but it seems it is not. And so we have to bring in all these data to say that by changing the medium of instruction from regional language to English doesn't help in any substantive way, doesn't help us in any substantive way. In fact, it creates multiple disadvantages. In fact, I'll just take 1 minute because I relate to his talk in one way, then I'll open the floor to questions. I'm reminded when in 1993 we opened our economy partially to the world. I remembered reading Ussa Patnaik's paper, which says that if we create enormous opportunities of the kind that opening of our economy to the world does, then it will privilege the better of people, people who already have education, more tools to take the advantage of new opportunities, and the people at the lowest rung cannot take the advantage of those. As a result, the gap between the rich and the poor will only increase. So the economic and social status of poor may improve as well as of rich will improve, but the gap will increase. Nobody believed her. And now you have enormous data to prove it, and now people have started believing it. It was a simple logic. Everybody should have been convinced about it, but USA could not convince. Now when you see in hard data the gap increasing, only then you believe. So what Dr. Rao presented should have been part of our intuitive knowledge, but he has to struggle to put the data together. See, in a language environment, if one language is not spoken, doesn't have enough support at home or in the playground, when we make that as the sole medium of instruction and also discourage children and teachers to speak in their mother tongues, we create huge disadvantage. You don't need a hell lot of research data or psychological literature or linguistic literature to tell you this. But now we have to harp on this with data. I'm very happy that he has put so much of data. Nobody can deny that English medium schools do not necessarily do better. Okay. And in fact, sometimes they create a disadvantage. We have 15 minutes, pretty much long time, I mean, quite good amount of time to take questions. So can we take questions from the audience now?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Rao, it's a pleasure to congratulate you for an excellent presentation with statistical to support your argument and evidences. I congratulate you. However, I have few questions, if you can substantiate further. I understand, and it is my belief, that language is a very important part to liberate and give freedom to human beings. And so we have done well to that extent. The other multilingual, I think there's the problem is posed. How much have you done to list or accumulate the various historical, philosophical, and also the cultural aspect of values that are either inherited or you have been inherited or whatever is been embedded values. I would be grateful if you can let me know in particularly. I hope I will not disappoint the others because I have not read some of this document. The second part, to have a higher relevance and personal relevance, both for social mobility and also economic mobility. The second aspect of that, yes, we agree with the ideas. This is something which we aspire, which is something which we hold very dear. However, whenever we either teach or make a documentation, we tend to translate.
We tend to translate.
We tend to translate. Translation is a transportation of ideas, and it is not an indigenous thing that reflect the inner core or aspiration of people. In this respect, how much work have you done? For instance, just to illustrate this as an example, the word democracy you have already mentioned. Obviously, the Klein-Steers had invented this word in 508 BC, but there is a document in India where the two historians have worked on it, saying that democracy predate Greeks, and it was there in the literature. However, I was trying to find out what were the exact word and terminology that used, because word being meaning, and it also reflects the values that have been passed, betrothed to us through the generation. So in that respect, while we are giving social mobility, while we are making them, empowering them with knowledge, also I would like you to tell us how much are we doing for the higher relevance, particularly in the philosophical and other levels. For instance, democracy words, not Loktantra, that is a translation. Liberty, you have in Sanskrit, but that is a translation. So wise. Thank you very much for the intervention.
Thank you, sir. The importance of translation for our languages, for Indian languages, is enormous. But it is equally important, I think, to transform our languages into knowledge languages in which knowledge texts are produced. So it is a project, very much an ongoing project. And as I said, now there are a few initiatives to do this systematically. The initiatives that were already in place, such as the Urdu Translation Bureau in Osmania University in Hyderabad up to the 1940s, was an enormously successful enterprise, which was fairly successfully dismantled when the university moved from Urdu medium to English medium. So I agree completely with you that translation is an enormously important activity, but it cannot stop there.
Any other question?
I see two hands there.
Hello, Dr. Rao. My name is Gunjan. I am by profession a teacher, and currently I conduct training workshops with teachers all across the country. So I've had the experience of having taught in a bilingual school. I have first-hand experience with children who learn bilingually and how they catch up. So all that I relate to. And now, since I am taking workshops with teachers who are teaching in those, very low-cost English medium schools in rural areas, so I also understand firsthand the damage that we are doing to our own education system, where the teachers themselves don't understand the basic English, and then they are transacting education, or that they're using books which are not meant for their children. So ultimately what happens is, with all those policies that are in practice and the students can't be detained, the teachers, they themselves told me that they sit with two pens, one blue and one red. So when the paper obviously is blank because the child does not understand the questions, not that they don't know. So first they write the answers and then they correct them with the pens so that the child is promoted, because otherwise they have no excuse of promoting the child. So this is the extent of damage that we have already done, and we are happily going on with it. So considering the work that you're doing, do you think it's realistic? Also considering the aspirational value that we have attached with English, and obviously the whatever economic advantages that it sort of holds up for us, do you think it's realistic at the center to go back to what you're saying that you've already implemented in Orissa? And if it is yes, we'll be very happy to have it back. When do you think realistically it's going to happen?
Yeah, sorry to hear all this. Yeah, it's really painful, that's right.
Yes.
As I said, enormous deal depends on convincing policymakers and communities that this is not a good idea. So the kind of study that the the Azim Premji Foundation did in one location needs to be replicated in many, many places to show that, look, it is not the case that students are doing better after 5 years of moving to an low-cost English medium school. I think the task is cut out for all of us to make this more and more widely available. Perhaps Minati has some suggestions to how to go about it. They have been trying for 20 years now, Professor Mohanty and Professor Panda. It's a battle. It's a battle against very large forces. There was a hand here first. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Padmini Borwa, and I've been, what has been happening in terms of multilingual, MTB, MLE, mother tongue-based multilingual education is really very promising for us. It's just that the reality is that there are these thousands of English medium schools, low cost, high cost. We probably also need to think about addressing how best to, what to do with children who are already studying there, because this is a phenomenon that is not going to stop. This is a parallel kind of a development. It's good to know MTB, MLE schools are coming up, and I'm from the northeast of India, and a lot of very good work is being done there for language communities, endangered communities. One of the problems that we see in these English medium schools is what we term teaching English as a subject, as opposed to teaching English as a language. And I heard in passing, you did suggest, I suppose, somewhere, that a good policy would be something which lets a child learn in their mother tongue for 8 to 10 years, and then follow that by teaching English as a subject before moving on to English as a language. Could you make a distinction? I mean, how does one make a distinction? Could you elaborate on this, please? Thank you.
One approach has been to introduce the other languages as subject languages rather than content languages. And then one model that has been tried out is to alternate. So 1 year science is taught in Spanish, and the other next year it's taught to the same children in English, so that by the end of 10 years of such bilingual education, they are equally competent to understand and understand science in both English and Spanish. So there are various models that have been tried, but the foundational point, the basic point is, of course, that the cognitive skills of the child are best developed in the mother tongue. Hence, everything should be, as far as possible, in the mother tongue.
Can I answer these two questions, this one and the earlier one together? I'll just take half a minute. These are the questions we have been struggling. You know, the objective of this mother tongue-based multilingual education is not different from the kind of objectives we have now. The objective is to develop strong linguistic skill in children. Now, the hitherto used paradigm doesn't help us. We have semilinguals or very poorly proficient, children, children with very poor proficiency both in English and in regional languages. Okay, so why we engage in a paradigmatic talk is because, nobody says that they should not learn English. No, they will learn English, they will learn Indian languages, but let's see what will be the best help to children, one. Second, what do we want? We want them to be good in mathematics, to be good in science, good, in other disciplines. The role of language in everyday world, in the playground, is slightly different from the kind of role it plays in classroom, because we deal with knowledge systems. So the children need some need to acquire the machinery of mathematics or of science, and language is mediating. If the language is not there with child at a particular level, then the child will not be able to get the machinery of the discipline. Now what is happening that the child knows, suppose, Odia very well, but we don't teach mathematics in Odia. We teach mathematics in English. So we create double disadvantage for the child. So we are talking about how to make these learning process easier, and also do in a manner that the child not only gets an entry into substantive disciplines, also gets, actually language is a tool, so you start with that. Child has necessary linguistic skill and the tools to get an entry into these disciplines. So how to help the school system produce strong bilinguals or multilinguals? That's what we are talking about. And the programs that we have now is not helping. The earlier one, what Professor Mohanty was talking about, English was introduced in class 4 or class 6 as a subject. Large part of teaching was done in, when I studied in Odia medium school. When I went to college, I was one of the topper, and when I went to college, in 15 days, people figured out that she's good in maths. It's not small college, so they figure out. you know, they were not surprised. If you are from Odia medium school and if you are doing well in mathematics, it's fine. In fact, if you are from convent school, you may not be necessarily doing well in mathematics. Yeah, that was the belief. So Odia medium schools are better in mathematics. Students coming from convent school are better in some other. So, you know, that system did work. I'm not saying, you know, replace the present system with that. No. I'm saying that the current system is not working. And all these new promises that the poorly funded, poorly conceived, low-cost English medium schools are giving, it's dangerous. I think this country has to, all countries have to seriously think about it because they're mushrooming. In UP, they are in many, you know, thousands now. Some of them are not recognized. Parents don't mind that. So long you wear a tie, you are well dressed, you are carrying a bag, you know, you look basically mediated image of a English medium child. So long you conform to that, it's fine. Okay, let's take some more questions.
I think we're, the organizers.
Okay, you know, the one person was raising hands since, so we'll take the last question.
Dr. Rao,
Yes,
my name is Pema Wangdi, and I'm from Bhutan. Bhutan is a very small country with a population of less than 1 million, but linguistically, it is a rich country. There are 19 different languages within a population of less than 1 million. The English is the main medium of instruction, and national language is also one of the mediums, but it plays a very limited role. The concept of mother tongue-based multilingual education is extremely new in Bhutan. But I like the idea, and you have proved that that is one of the strategies to counteract the dominant role of English as the medium of instruction. But I see there could be several challenges, especially because many of the languages of the world are not written. In fact, of the 7,102 languages, only 300 are written. Specifically, it's only 286 that are written. So many of the languages are not written, and even in Bhutan, only one language is officially written. So when you introduce this multilingual, mother tongue-based multilingual education, how do you develop this teaching, learning materials? I see that as a big challenge because, particularly if the language is not written, and even if you use an existing script to write that language, but still developing these resources would be a major challenge.
Yes, it is a
and
major challenge.
How do you overcome
it?
this?
It is a major challenge
Thank
for
you.
many languages of indigenous peoples. And this is a longer conversation. Perhaps we can have it over tea.
You know, it's not, it's good that he took the question from you. You can discuss outside the room, you know, after this session so that others can, you know, attend other sessions. Thank you, Dr. Rao. And it's my pleasure to hand over you a small token given by British Council. It actually has your photograph and it's a memento.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Sorry?